Hi, I'm Josh Rushing, filling in for Femi OK, and you're in the stream. Today, after decades of failure, will a new round of U.S.-led negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians produce a peace deal? Our digital producer, Malika Blau, is here looking out for your live feedback. And Malika, whenever we talk about Israel and Palestine, it's one of the hottest topics that we come across on the stream, right? Mm-hmm. But this time we actually did something different. We conducted a poll to see how people thought about today's question.
Exactly.
What did we find out?
And so basically we asked, will a new round of U.S.-led negotiations, as you mentioned, produce a just and lasting peace agreement? Now, the results may surprise some people, but spoiler alert, they probably won't. I pulled them up here on my screen. 80% are pessimistic, while 11% are hopeful that it will produce a just and lasting peace agreement, and 9% just aren't sure. We'll see if we change any minds over the course of today's show. So tweet us your questions and your comments. Make sure you use the hashtag AJStream.
I think the surprising part would be the 9% that aren't sure.
Right.
But what you can do is you can go to stream.aljazeera.com and you can vote in that poll during the show. And if those numbers change dramatically, we'll look at it throughout the show and bring you the results by the end. Now, sitting between Malika and me is Hussein Ibish, the senior fellow at the American Task Force on Palestine, an organization that supports U.S. efforts to restart negotiations. Hussein, welcome to the program.
Oh, thank you very much. Good to be here.
Great. All right, of course, this show is driven by your ideas and participation. So if you have a pitch for a possible episode in the future, just post it on Facebook. Go to facebook.com/AJStream. It could actually wind up on air.
My name is Hikmet Karcic. I'm an activist from Sarajevo, and I am in the stream.
Over decades, the United States has led many unsuccessful rounds of Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. The peace process under President Bill Clinton in the 1990s, the roadmap under President George W. Bush, and more recently during President Obama's first term. But now, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry says Israelis and Palestinians are close to a new round of talks. According to one Israeli official, talks could begin as soon as Tuesday. So is anything different this time? And are there alternatives to the U.S. approach? To help us explore this, we're joined here in Washington, D.C. by Palestinian human rights lawyer Noura Erakat. From Jerusalem, Gil Hoffman is chief political correspondent at the Jerusalem Post. And from London, Demi Rader is a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. He's a contributing editor to the online 972 magazine. All right, welcome everyone. I'd like to begin with you, Hussein.
Sure.
Why is the U.S. pushing for negotiations now?
Well, I think it's because the Secretary Kerry has an understanding of the huge political impact that this has. This is not an optional issue for the United States. This is a vital American national interest. And I think you sort of can't maintain the kind of position that Washington has had for the past 10 years or so, that this is a vital national interest, but we can't want it more than the parties themselves. If it's vital national interest, you can and must want it more than anybody else, and you can't give people a veto. And you just got done talking with Malika here about how much enthusiasm for this issue and passion people show around the world who watch your show for this issue. And that's a reflection of the emotional investment that people around the world, especially in the Arab world and in the Islamic world, have in this issue, and it's completely disproportional importance. So Secretary Kerry realizes that this is one of the most important things the United States has to do, no matter how difficult it is, and that's why now, because it just can't be avoided.
Gil, Hussein's saying that the U.S. is pushing this now because it's such an important issue. 80% of our audience says that they have low hopes for it. What's the feeling there in Israel?
I think the numbers in Israel are actually fascinating. There was a poll that was published in Haaretz a couple days ago that found that a peace agreement reached by Netanyahu, 55% of Israelis would support it. And if you factor out the people saying, I don't know, it ends up being 2/3 of the population. So in the past, people in Israel might have been skeptical about the Palestinians coming to the table, but now that they finally have, Israelis hope and they think that Netanyahu can do it, can reach an agreement with the Palestinians, that he wants to reach an agreement with the Palestinians. And as someone who's followed Netanyahu closely, he's come a long way, and he intends to make sacrifices to allow the peace process to move forward in a very serious kind of way.
Malika, what's the community saying?
Well, there's just still a lot of skepticism, of course. Haruna on Facebook says, if the negotiator/referee is seen as defending the interest of one side and thereby not appearing to be impartial, then question marks shall continue to remain over the outcome of any peace talks. So Noura, I want to give that one to you. And basically, Kerry obviously has a lot on his plate. What can he do to make sure that this succeeds?
Well, I also want to respond to Hussein and Gil on their points about American and Israeli enthusiasm. I think that both the U.S. and Israel has a lot to gain from this peace process. One, because Israel is now facing increasing scrutiny for its atrocities on the ground and has been subject to a mounting boycott campaign, most recently an EU decision that has put pressure on it. In order to deflect that, what better way than to enter the peace process? Similarly, the U.S., as Hussein rightly pointed out, is very interested in not being seen as such a hostile entity throughout the Arab and Muslim world. And so what they need to do is as little as possible in order to be able to regain their legitimacy. And so I think what we're likely to see come out of this is probably an economic deal that will incrementally improve the Palestinian livelihood on the ground, while not shifting any of the power dynamics in the region, and yet still benefit the U.S. and Israel while Israel continues its daily atrocities and continues to expand its settler colonial regime.
Demi, can you talk to us from the European perspective here? I mean, they recently came out and said that they were going to make sure they weren't funding anything that goes towards supporting the settlements. Is the U.S. the right, are they the honest broker that should be at the table, or would the EU or EC be better in this regard?
Well, I think the U.S. is the only broker that's in any position to apply any pressure, serious pressure to Israel. Whether it's going to do that, it's anyone's guess. My guess is it's not. It hasn't before, and there are no real reasons for it to start now. The only thing the role that the EU can play here is maybe do what it started doing last week, which is showing some signs of displeasure, some limitations, very limited so far, if you pardon the tautology, but basically playing a side role. And I have to agree with Noor that if we even get something like an improved economic situation, it'll be already more than I think many expect. I think on the whole we're up for another round that's not going to change much on the ground.
Well, Noura, is there even a reason for the Palestinians to come to the table then?
Well, as far as the Palestinians are concerned, the leadership frankly has nothing to lose at this point. It continues to govern only in a bifurcated government, only in the West Bank. It continues to govern without a presidential mandate. It has lost its legitimacy, especially in the aftermath of the Palestine Papers and an ongoing Arab uprising. And so it has little to lose, and being able to attend the peace talks and come home with an economic plan might extend its shelf life a bit more. As far as the Palestinian people are concerned, they're much more eager to pursue alternative means, including internationalizing this conflict and its resolution, and that are aimed at exposing Israeli atrocities rather than facilitating them.
But in light of all that you mentioned there, do the Palestinian negotiators even have the power or the authority? Do they have their own constituency to negotiate? Can they bring anything to the table?
At this point, the Palestinian Authority has already brought a lot. Israel asked for security, and so now more than half of the Palestinian national economy funds Palestinian security forces who protect the Israeli settlers who are already armed from Palestinian protests and discontent, rather than protecting Palestinians from the occupation itself or resisting it altogether. What they do have, what the leadership does have, is a lot of external support from the EU and from the US and from elsewhere of wanting to see this conflict contained and somehow put with a lid put on it. And so they have a lot of external funding in order to continue, frankly, what's become a bit farcical.
I mean, I think that's a kind of a very unfair characterization of the Palestinian security services, in the sense that the sine qua non of governance, even under the onerous conditions of occupation, Palestinian self-governance, any kind of law and order, the sine qua non is stability, is security. And I think that the fact that the security forces did bring law and order back to otherwise lawless places and have managed to maintain a calm situation has actually benefited the Palestinian people, the Palestinian economy, the Palestinian way of life. And there's a lot to be built on here. There is a need not just for top-down diplomacy, but also from bottom-up grassroots efforts that should be engaged in not just with the PA and with the leadership in Ramallah, but also with civil society, with grassroots organizations, etc. If there is an economic package here, which I think there should be as a beginning, it needs to be done with accountability, with transparency, with all the elements of good governance, reform, and oversight that were pioneered by the former Prime Minister Salam Fayyad and that made some progress. And I really think that it's very important to bring in Palestinian civil society into this process so we have a bottom-up approach as well as a top-down approach and that can at some point become a virtuous circle. Let me just say this. There's a lot of talk on this show today about optimism and pessimism. These are not political categories, right? They don't mean anything politically. They're affects. They're emotional affects. What we should look at is the balance of forces that produce outcomes and how we can get the best possible outcome. And the question we have to ask ourselves is it better to have talks or is it better to have no talks?
What does our community say about that?
All right.
Well, I think that begs the question of whether or not the status quo is the ideal. Gil, I want to bring you in here. Sir Nigel on Twitter says, for as long as anyone can remember, Israelis and Palestinian negotiations have been ongoing. Clearly, though, the fundamentals haven't been addressed. And on Facebook, Jamil says, negotiations require each side to give up something tangible and valuable. No sacrifice, no gain. So I think that begs the question, what is each side willing to give up on, willing to negotiate? What is Israel willing to negotiate?
Israel is coming to the table knowing that that's where the decisions are made. You know, the Palestinians tried to have preconditions, tried to say that in advance of the talks, Israel would have to release murderers from prison as if that's what would allow there to be peace. Netanyahu all along insisted, no, there have to be talks without preconditions, and America agreed with Netanyahu, and that's what's going to be happening starting on Tuesday. And so Netanyahu, his favorite word is reciprocity. He says that the other side has to give in order to get. And so he's willing to go a long way. Netanyahu would be the prime minister that ends up leaving, I think, 90-something% of the West Bank, which would be a very, very difficult thing. It's the biblical heartland of the Jewish people. Netanyahu comes from a family that believes that you have to keep all the land of Israel. And I see him willing to make history.
What about settlements, Gil?
Look, there's nothing holy about the pre-67 border. It was an armistice line that was intended to last for a few days after Israel's War of Independence. The final line is going to be drawn in negotiations. The negotiations that are going to be starting on Tuesday in Washington. After that, everyone will know what side of the line everyone can build on. The overwhelming majority of the West Bank is barren, and there can be a Palestinian state there. There are the communities in the biblical heartland of the Jewish people, Judea and Samaria, as they're called in the Bible, that have been more successful, where the overwhelming majority of the Jews there live, will end up staying. There's going to be land swaps. As they said, everyone's going to have to make compromises. The Israeli side is willing to make compromises. America obviously wants there to be compromises. It's the Palestinian side that has to prove itself after failing their people time and time again.
I think everybody has to prove themselves. The one thing that really needs to be corrected is the idea that there aren't preconditions. There are tons of preconditions. Israel has tons of preconditions, and everybody has had their list of preconditions. The extent to which they're publicly acknowledged or not is a different matter. But the idea that these are talks taking place without preconditions is wrong.
Demi, is Netanyahu hamstrung by the conservatives in his own party on this?
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, Netanyahu himself is profoundly conservative. I mean, he made exactly one or two references to a Palestinian state in the so far 4 years and something that he's been in power, and he opposes it his entire political life. Forgive me if I don't take him at his word a few years ago at Bar Ilan. Secondly, Yes, his cabinet is profoundly conservative. I think only 2 or 3 ministers in the cabinet are on record supporting the two-state solution. 2/3 of it are opposed to the two-state solution. And thirdly, and perhaps equally importantly, I mean, the conflict has simply not been an important issue in the last elections. This is not a topic on which anyone wants to gamble, not Netanyahu and not his so-called centrist partners. So far, the resumption of the talks has allowed Yair Lapid and Tzipi Livni to go to their centrist electorate and say, well, look, guys, you see Netanyahu is negotiating. We were right to go into this right-wing government. But I don't think this is a point on which anybody is going to have to face a moment of truth. It's not something that the government will fall upon.
So, Nora, I just want to hear from you. Do you think these talks can work? What are the odds?
Well, they'll work as that they've worked for the past 20 years. Well, they'll continue to contain the conflict. They'll allow Israel, under the cover of diplomacy, to continue its settler colonial expansion. Its settler population has increased from 200,000 in 1992 to 600,000 today. And, you know, something for the viewers to consider. We're talking about two states, but if we look at a map, you cannot find a single contiguous Palestinian population or any contiguous land that would belong to Palestinians. And so continuing on looking at it on the ground right now, there's only a disconnected set of Bantustans. Now, if you actually visit the region, and I hope that you do, because then you can see that the Palestinian police forces are not actually bringing stability as much as they're causing a lot of rife within communities. But if you go on the ground, you'll also notice that Palestinian populations are increasingly herded into areas where they're separated from one another. So that Palestinians in Ramallah are far away from those in Bethlehem, are far away from those in Hebron, and certainly a vast distance from those in the Gaza Strip. And what separates all of them are Jewish Israeli colonies and only, that belong to them only, as well as roads that belong to them only, and other industries, Jewish industries, that Palestinians have no access to. And yet the distance between them is vastly broad because of the two sets of laws that treat Palestinians as inferior to their Jewish Israeli counterparts.
Nura mentioned a lot of things that I want you to pick up on, but I want you to do it in addition to with this tweet. Seifa says the greatest risk would be continued illegal settlement expansion, which coincidentally always occurs during peace talks. I know you want to respond, but also, should borders be the first thing that gets talked about?
I think it's extremely important that one of the first things that gets established as the talks grow into real negotiations is to strongly limit settlement activity. Settlement activity is completely unacceptable, and I think it's clearly the United States position. It's the international position, and I think it is the single gravest threat to a peace agreement. I think Nora is right if you look at the map in theory, but if you look at just the built-up areas, if you look at where the settlers live, it's still possible to create a Palestinian state with about a 3.5 or 3.7% land swap, as long as you do a deal on Jerusalem as well. So as if you accept all the kind of areas that are slated for settlement expansion and all the roads and everything else as a given, if you take the situation in its theoretically worst term on paper and see that as immutable and irreversible, then yes, I think then she's right. But that's not the case. In fact, it's still possible. And my point is, as far as I know, Nora doesn't support the creation of two states. She supports a single state. So I think we can expect her to just throw cold water on this and be against it in principle. Correct me if I'm wrong, please, Nora.
If I can jump in there just for a second.
And I would love to answer Hussein.
Yeah,
yes.
that would be really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. I have the troubling feeling that if we were conducting this interview 20 years ago, Hussein would be saying the same things. If you look at the map and accept all the theoretical expansion that was to happen, then yes, it looks pretty bad, but we can still build a state on what there is with some minimal land swaps. 20 years down the line, the processes, all the kind of like all those theories of plans on the maps and the projected settlement expansions have been happening, whereas the two-state solution is not. So I think Noura has every reason to worry about the settlements, about the projected roads. And by the way, I mean, if kind of also connecting to the previous question, the Israeli government is not showing any sign of slowing down settlement construction, and now they're going even so far as to propose to implement into their outline planning for the West Bank. They're now proposing to build railroads between Palestinian cities, and Israel. It's not, you don't invent something in the territory that you're about to leave. Every indication on the ground says that the theory of settlements is being put into practice, where the theory of the two-state solution is remaining very much a theory.
So two-state solution, Nora, two-state or one-state solution?
So I just want to respond that I do support the one-state solution, but I'm not averse to the two-state solution. And I think that if it was possible, I think that it would be a good incremental step, but we shouldn't lose sight that what is fundamentally at issue here isn't that Palestinians can't govern themselves in a statelet or some sort of territorial entity. The fundamental issue here is that Palestinians as a population are subject to a settler colonial regime which deems them as inferior to their Jewish Israeli counterparts. And a case in point is the fact that 40,000 Palestinian citizens of Israel in the Negev today are at risk of being displaced and put into urban townships in the name of progress. So even those Palestinians within Israel who have citizenship are subject to very similar racism and discriminatory laws. And so I don't oppose a two-state solution if it also included
You just made the case for a
rights
two-state solution.
if it also included the rights for Palestinian refugees to return and the rights of
hold on, guys.
Palestinian
She really
citizens of
has
Israel.
just
Hold
made
on, I
an
wanna bring
excellent
Gil
case
in.
for the two-state
I want to bring
solution.
Gil.
It's
Gil,
excellent.
I'd like you to
Thank
respond
you.
to what Nora was just saying, and also this issue of settlements. Did you imply in your answer before that you think the settlements will be up for relocating and that Netanyahu can do that, considering who his support is in the coalition government?
Absolutely. But first of all, I think it's very funny that Noura is talking about racism. When she supports one state, I assume that state will not be a Jewish state. She wants a Palestinian state. She wants there to be a 58th Muslim state in the world while there be no Jewish state. I'm sorry, that
Couldn't
sounds
it be
like
a pluralistic
racism to
state,
me.
Gil? Why does it have to be
And,
Jewish or a Muslim
regarding-
state? Couldn't it be a pluralistic state?
You're going to have a Jewish state, you're going to have a Palestinian state, just like you already have a Palestinian state in Jordan. If Hamas and Fatah can't agree, you'll end up having 3 Palestinian states, one in the West Bank, one in Jordan, and one in Gaza, with the Palestinian people being so divided. Settlements is not the issue. John Kerry talked to the Palestinians, and he said to them, you're missing the point. You're off by one letter. That letter is S. If you keep on obsessing over settlements, there won't be what you really want, which is a settlement, a peace agreement that's going to end the conflict.
All right,
And so
I want to change the subject just for a second, Gil. I want to know from everyone what happens next if these peace talks fail. I'm going to start here with Hussein.
I think we have to be very, very cautious about this because while I've rejected the terms optimism and pessimism, and I do welcome the Secretary's achievement, I'm very cautious about any chance for any immediate progress in the very near future. So what's required is to hedge against that by changing realities on the ground, by making life better for people on the ground, restricting settlement activity, by reviving the Palestinian economy with transparency, with accountability, by
I'm down to
engaging
under a
civil
minute.
society.
I'm down
all
to under a
that
minute,
stuff.
so I need
what
quick
we have-
answers here. Gil,
what we
can
have
you
to
tell
do is
me,
move
are you
forward.
worried about violence there if these peace talks fail?
Absolutely. The extremists among the Palestinians always, whenever there's a peace process, try to screw it up. They start blowing up pizza parlors and playgrounds, and that's what's resulted in there not being a Palestinian state. Both their leadership and their extremists have always gotten
All right, Gil, I've got to cut you off there.
There was a man
I've got to
called
cut you off
Baruch
there because we're
Goldstein,
going
by
to
the way.
end the show on Al Jazeera. Thanks everyone for joining us. Now look, this is going to continue on the post show. So right now, go to stream.aljazeera.com. On Monday's show, a train crash in Spain, a beheaded referee, a singer shot on stage, all disturbing images that went viral. With every click, we're bombarded with these violent images. What are the long-term mental consequences? We'll see you online. Welcome back to our online post show. We've been talking about the U.S.-led efforts to renew negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians. I want to pick up where we left off. And where we left off was, could these peace talks actually present a danger? If they fail, do we look at going back to violence again? Gil had just given me his answer on that, and Nora, I didn't get to hear from you.
I think that the danger that's being posed is that we're really we're prolonging this conflict by not getting to the heart of the matter. And the truth of the matter is that Israelis right now are living in relative stability compared to their Palestinian counterparts who endure structural violence day in and day out. And as a result of this ongoing project, which has been unabated, they will continue to suffer more. And the peace process will offer a veneer to cover Israelis' atrocities on the ground. And so that's why it's dangerous. And I encourage us to consider other options that include what Hussein was talking about. Civil society, bottom-up approaches have encouraged the international community to boycott Israel, to isolate it in order to compel it to come within the bounds of human rights norms and international law, at the very least.
Well, I come very close to agreeing with that, with the exception that I don't see these two things as contradictory. Positive bottom-up approaches, positive approaches to civil society, certainly boycotts and non-cooperation aimed at the occupation, but not at Israel as such. All of that can be very, very positive. The EU guidelines were, I think, a very useful addition and a reminder to Israel that the international community doesn't accept this occupation. If it thinks that Israel has no intention to end it, then its relationship with Israel is going to change, including its Western support base. So I think that's all really extremely important. But at the same time, there is no other way in the end other than to find a negotiation. I've never heard of any agenda for resolving this conflict that doesn't end up at the negotiating table.
Because we haven't been creative enough. We've only looked to the powers that be in order to search for solutions.
But don't you think there needs to be an agreement?
If you keep doing the same thing over and over and over again, I think some would say we're crazy.
Wait, I don't understand what you're saying. Hold on, I just don't understand what Nora's saying. Are you saying that in the end there is a way of resolving this without having an agreement between the two sides?
I think that there will be an agreement. I think that the way that we've gone about it, by depending on the U.S. as the sole broker in bilateral negotiations, is not the way to get there. We need to internationalize this conflict.
Here's
we need to
problem.
compel Israel. We need to compel Israel as an international community in order to become within the norms of international rights and human rights norms, at the very least not to treat Palestinians as inferior, whose lives and livelihood are contingent on Israeli security or so-called security. And we've seen other examples in the past, such as where civil society has prevailed, such as within the U.S., which overcame slavery and Jim Crow, as well as apartheid South Africa.
Nuda, you mentioned internationalizing. Hussein, you mentioned the EU guidelines. So people want to know, is there an alternative? Ibrahim on Twitter says, America is not an impartial negotiator in the crisis. They're part of the problem. On Facebook, we asked, well, who could come into the middle? Who could take the place of the U.S.? Anna on Facebook says Switzerland or Palau or something along those ranks. Clearly, she's being tongue-in-cheek. But Dimi, I want you to pick up in here because we haven't heard from you in a bit. Of course, what is the EU's role? Is there an alternative to the U.S.?
Well, again, the EU can apply pressures in certain places that the U.S. they're not because of American internal politics. But the U.S. is still the most important international player as Israel's principal backer. But here's what the U.S. can do. A couple of months ago, Secretary Kerry said in Senate that the two-state solution is about 18 months more to go. I would call on him to make this serious stated official deadline and indicate that if the two-state solution does not succeed this time around, the U.S. will start looking for alternatives that guarantee security and political rights to both parties and correspond to American interests, because obviously they won't do anything that doesn't correspond to American interests. But the point is we need to get out of this loop of constantly talking about the two-state solution as if it's the only solution. There are other ways to solve national conflicts, international conflicts. And if we just keep chasing that, while Israel is continuing to build settlements and cementing its control, we're going to be having the same conversations only a few years and a few more lost lives down the line.
Well, the Stream team actually sent a query to the High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy at the EU. They sent us a statement back saying, Quote, while warmly welcoming the efforts of John Kerry, the EU stands ready to play a more active role in the context of a resumption in negotiations. The EU has offered active and concrete support to help ensure negotiations between the parties are successful.
Right.
So,
can I translate that into English for you?
Go for it.
It's the same thing as the Quartet, which was the EU, the US, Russia, and the UN Secretariat, which was the world, which was set up to support US brokering of this peace process. Now, the one thing that needs to be said is you can say that the negotiations are a bad idea or be against them. There is no alternative to the United States. It's not like the United States is fighting off a bunch of challengers. Nobody else wants this job. There's nobody trying to do it, let alone any other power capable of doing it. So if you believe in a negotiated agreement and you want to make progress incrementally, both on the ground and at the top level, you've got to have the United States involved, because there isn't an alternative at the moment. And this is a fact. That's not an opinion. That's a fact.
Right,
Gil?
but we also need to consider that the U.S. did fight off a few people in the Security Council when it vetoed in February 2011 a resolution that would condemn the settlements that mirrored U.S. language. And it did fight off the rest of the international community that voted overwhelmingly for a Palestinian state. So although the U.S. might not be fighting as you're saying it, they're doing quite a bit of fighting to keep this away from the international community and to keep it away from international law.
Gil, I'd like to hear you respond to Nora's main point that Palestinians are being treated as second-class citizens or worse within Israel, including the ones that have Israeli citizenship.
She should ask Salim Jubran, the Israeli Supreme Court Justice, who's Arab, who's the head of our Central Elections Committee. He's the man who decides how elections are run in this country. I've been to South Africa. You would never have anything like that happen in South Africa. In Israel, we have a 20% Arab minority that has better treatment and better lives than Arabs do in any Arab country,
That's absurd.
Certainly than Jews do.
That's ridiculous.
In any Arab country, Jews are being persecuted in Arab countries.
Are you trying to tell me? Hold on.
Jews aren't going to be living in Saudi Arabia, and you know what? I've been interrupted almost every time I've spoken here, and it's important to say that the Palestinian state that Noura wants to create will have no Jews in it at all.
Oh, I never said that. That's not fair. I have to interrupt you. I never said that.
I agree with you. That's totally unfair.
Gil's point is bringing to light something very fundamental about Israel and Israelis. He conflates hegemony with survival. Either we are in control or we're going to perish. And it doesn't work like that. Sorry, Gil. I mean, there are other ways to run the state other than being in complete control totally over everything all the time. And it doesn't mean that you're going to get marched off and shot up against the
Unfortunately, security realities in the region, when we're surrounded by our enemies, Israel has to be able to defend itself. Israel's not going to allow situations to happen like they were in the past.
Listen, you've got a peace treaty with Jordan. You've got a peace treaty with Egypt. You've got working cooperative relationships with the PA in the West Bank, which has kept violence against Israelis to a very small minimum in the past 2 years, according to Shin Bet. We want to sit here and pretend that you're surrounded by enemies and hostile and anti-Semitic. This is nonsense. And if you want to sit here also and try to pretend that the Palestinian citizens of Israel do not face significant and serious discrimination, and the Palestinians that live under Israeli rule in the occupied territories are not totally disenfranchised non-citizens who suffer a kind of discrimination that is absolutely unique in the world today, then you're engaging in propaganda that is beneath you, beneath the viewers, beneath anyone's intelligence, and beneath contempt.
All right, look, I've got to stop it there. You know what? We can continue this debate online, though. We can continue it on Twitter, include at AJ Stream on there, so we can be a part of it. I just want to kind of bring up the poll. Looks like we did not change many minds, Malika.
It went from 80% to 81%.
81%
more pessimistic. Yes.
So we discouraged another 1%. All right, look, thanks to all our guests. Thanks to Hussein, Nora, Gil, and Demi. On Monday's show, a train crash in Spain, a beheaded referee, or a singer shot on stage. They're all disturbing images that went viral. With every click, we're bombarded with violent images. But what are the long-term mental consequences? We'll look into that. And until then, we'll see you online.